Welcome to Barnet Museum, a treasure trove of facts and objects which tell Barnet's story. If you know us already, I hope this will encourage you to return. And if you haven't visited us yet, it will inspire you to do so. As chairman of the trustees, it's my privilege to give two short talks. In this one, a potted history of the museum and why local history matters, and in the next, a taster of what you can discover for yourself behind the museum's doors. Let me start at the beginning. In 1927, Mr. B.R. Leftwich, a civil servant and librarian, wrote to the local newspaper claiming that the town of Barnet was losing its identity and that its buildings and traditions were changing for the worse. He proposed the setting up of the Barnet Records Society to collect documents and artefacts to keep alive the history of the town. Here you can see his letter. It starts with a cry of civic pride which we can have some sympathy with almost a century later. Sir, Mr. Leftwich writes, most people are interested in the town in which they live and are proud of its history, especially when, as in the case of Barnet, it can be traced back to prehistoric times. But, he laments, Barnet is fast becoming a suburb of London. All its old landmarks are fast disappearing, and there is a danger that in a few years' time all trace of them may be lost. So he came up with an idea. All the historic documents of Barnet should be brought together to create a centralised record of Barnet's past, beginning with, and he lists them, the parish registers, the court rolls, photographs of important buildings, architectural drawings of churches, and tombstone inscriptions. You'd agree, quite a project. So Mr. Leftwich invited local people to volunteer to take his idea forward, and in this way, almost a century ago, he planted the seed corn of what became Barnet Museum. What I find fascinating about this letter, framed and on display as you enter the museum, is how it reminds us of three main reasons why local history matters. First, in a place like Barnet, which has a history going back to the prehistoric times, local history links place names with an ancient landscape. About 80 years ago, the hornbeam in the photo on the left was planted in Barnet Gate Wood to replenish the ancient woodland there. And on the right you can see a charming engraving made 140 years ago of the so-called Latimer's Elm, under which Bishop Latimer was supposed to have preached a sermon in the reign of Henry VIII, but probably didn't. Turning to some of our familiar town names, consider for a moment their meaning. Barnet, a burnt clearing in the woods, or from the Saxon, a little hill. Cockfosters, the home of the chief foresters. Hadley, a high place in the woods. Enfield, a forest clearing. Place names identify us with our local topography, reminding us of how wooded and hilly this part of England still is, perched on the edge of the Thames Basin, the highest point on the Great North Road from London to York. It's interesting to reflect that when we look towards the Shard and Canary Wharf from the tower of Barnet Church at the top of the High Street, travellers at the time Queen Boudicca sacked Londinium would have seen very much the same contours of landscape as we do today, but more densely wooded and with smoke curling up from occasional clearings in the thicket. Second, at times of change, local history helps us to keep burnished the collective memory of how things used to be, of the old landmarks which Mr. Leftwich described as fast disappearing under the sprawl of suburban London. And it does so by preserving artefacts and documents which trigger our imagination of what those times were like. This trend, if we can call it that, started centuries ago in the 16th century. We can trace its beginnings to when the Reformation and the break with Rome purged the English landscape of saints, holy wells, sacred stones, sacred trees, and countless shrines. That cleared the way for people to treat such things as relics of the past rather than mystical landmarks, and to investigate an earlier history of the Romans and the ancient Britons, and to trace in pots and mosaic, earthworks and ruins how our ancestors lived. Change in the rural and urban environment, whether in the 1620s, 1920s or 2020s, have encouraged people to be antiquarians, to collect old things in order to keep the collective memory of successive generations alive and to make local folk proud of where they lived. That's the third reason why local history matters: civic pride and a sense of belonging. Pride in hometowns and counties took off with the Stuarts in the 17th century. Groups of local gentlemen became intensely proud of where they lived. They commissioned maps, drawings and local monuments. The obelisk memorial to the Battle of Barnet in Hadley Highstone is a mid-18th century example of this blossoming interest in local history. Thus, Mr. Leftwich's letter encapsulates almost everything we need to know about why there should be a local museum in Barnet. But the Barnet Record Society sadly did not stand the test of time. It changed its name to the Barnet and Local History Society. And why? Because very simply records were being confused with gramophone records. As its collection of artefacts grew alongside the documents, the Society began keeping an ad hoc museum, housed in no permanent home but in transient locations: schools, council offices and other local buildings. In 1938, the History Society's fortunes took a turn for the better. Hertfordshire County Council and Barnet Urban District Council arranged for the Society to use two terraced early Georgian houses at 31 and 33 Wood Street to exhibit its collection of artefacts and store its impressive archive of documents. And in March 1938, Barnet Museum was founded. Then World War II broke out, and in 1941 half of the museum building at 33 Wood Street was completely destroyed by a German bomb. Mercifully, the museum's collection had been previously moved for safekeeping and so was later returned unscathed to 31 Wood Street after the bomb damage had been made good. Following the war, the Museum and History Society continued as a steady feature of Barnet life. As you can see from this map, its area of interest, or catchment, grew to include High Barnet, Underhill, Arkley, Hadley, Hadley Wood, East Barnet, New Barnet, Whetstone and Totteridge. Occasionally and exceptionally, items from further afield would be accepted into the collection because of their special importance to Barnet, and this practice has continued. From the 1960s, the museum enjoyed 4 mellow decades of relative quiet and stability. The new London Borough of Barnet was created in 1965, and in the 1970s the museum underwent a major refurbishment of its interior. Under the leadership of Dr. Gillian Gear, the History Society developed a reputation for sound research and study of local history and hosting local archives. The museum became more professional in collecting, interpreting and exhibiting objects, attaining Arts Council accreditation as a registered museum. Gillian was a hugely loved and respected member of the Barnet community and a major influence on the museum, and you can see her in the photo on the right. She was awarded the British Empire Medal in recognition of her distinguished public service and died in 2015, an enormous loss to the museum and Barnet. During the 10 years before her death, Gillian had a battle on her hands. The museum had never been a high financial priority of Barnet Council, and so it came as no real surprise when the council, in 2009, began to target local museums for closure. It succeeded with a closure in Hendon of Church Farmhouse Museum, which was council-owned and funded. But Barnet Museum happily proved a more stubborn adversary. Its independent charitable status, lengthy tenure of 31 Wood Street, and huge public support gave the museum an advantage and the practical means of thwarting attempts to evict it. In 2018, Barnet Museum and Local History Society became an incorporated charity with its own board of trustees, and after much negotiation was granted by the council a new 125-year lease of 31 Wood Street at a peppercorn rent. The museum's home and future was at long last secured. Here we see a photo on the left of the museum curator, Mike Noronha, our patron, Martin Russell, Representative Deputy Lieutenant for the London Borough of Barnet, and distinguished visitor, His Royal Highness the Duke of Gloucester. At the end of 2019, the museum acquired another property, the Physic Well. This is a mineral water spring-fed well on what was called Barnet Common. The well was a popular source of medicinal waters for many years before its most famous mentions in Samuel Pepys's diary in 1664 and 1667. Indeed, in 1652, Barnet Well had been ranked with Tunbridge and Epsom for the excellence of its waters, but its fame was not sustained, and in time it fell out of favour, being largely covered up by the 1840s. In the late 1920s, a council estate was built around the area of the well, and in 1937 a housing in the Tudor style was built over it. This was probably part of an effort to boost heritage interest in the area. One of the nearby new roads was named Pepys Crescent. However, the outbreak of war 2 years later saw the well house abandoned. Over the next decades, the building gradually deteriorated, although it was remembered in the naming of the Well House Hospital Trust, now known as Barnet Hospital. The museum unofficially looked after the well and opened it occasionally to researchers and interested parties. In 2018, Historic England, the Heritage of London Trust, Barnet Museum and Barnet Council refurbished the well house and brought it back to its 1937 condition. Then in 2019, the museum formally opened the Physic Well to the public every month from February to November. In November 2019, the museum signed a 50-year lease with the council and will continue to manage this historic building as a reminder of those long-distant days when folk flocked to Barnet to take its waters. If you would like to know what lies inside Barnet Museum, please listen to my next talk. In the meantime, my sincere thanks to those whose names now appear, and in particular to those museum champions B.R. Leftwich and Gillian Gear, and to the health professionals and staff who work at Barnet Hospital and to whom, especially during the current pandemic, our community owes so much.